the whole point of my research is actually how to look at arguments not as opportunities to prove the opposite person wrong, but rather to explore their opinions. And I think that right now in the media and in the political discourse, issues are raised not to discuss, but to divide.
Welcome to the inaugural TutorWorks Take Note podcast. Today I'd like to welcome our special guest, Dr. Mark Felton, Professor of Teacher Education at San Jose State University. Dr. Felton's research focuses on the development of argumentative reasoning skills, particularly through the use of classroom discourse and deliberation. He's the author of numerous publications, including Arguing to Agree, Mitigating My Side Bias Through Consensus Dialogue. Welcome, Dr. Felton.
Hi, Deanna. Thanks for having me speak today.
Thank you for being here. I'd like to start by asking, what are argumentative reasoning skills, and why is it important to develop these reasoning skills?
So if it's okay, I'd like to take a step back and talk first a little bit about what argumentative reasoning is, and then talk a little bit about what the skills are. So argumentative reasoning is defined as a process by which we use reasons and evidence to support our conclusions. And while we might think of reasoning as a thoughtful process that works towards reaching conclusions, there's been a lot of research over the last 50 years that suggests that that process can often work the other way around. So in other words, we can just as often start with our conclusions and use reasoning to rationalize what we already believe. But that kind of thinking is not always in our best interests. And sometimes our reasoning is driven by unexamined beliefs or self-destructive personal motives. And sometimes it's driven by quick cognitive processes that might lead to errors in our reasoning. And that's what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have referred to as System 1 thinking or fast thinking. And they admit that sometimes this thinking can be quick and efficient, and it allows us to really reach conclusions under duress. But on the other hand, it can also lead us to make snap judgments and engage in biases that reinforce themselves over time. And so it can work in either way. So to get back to your original question, I'd say that argumentative reasoning skills can be understood as those skills that allow us to slow down and interrogate our System 1 thinking when we need to. It allows us to really question the assumptions that we're making or the conclusions that we're trying to draw and really take a close look at them. So Kahneman and Tversky call that System 2 or slow thinking.
Tell us more about your research in argumentative reasoning.
Yeah, so I study argumentative reasoning specifically in conversational contexts, so dialogue with people who disagree with each other. And I'm interested in the ways that individuals learn to leverage disagreeing dialogue to challenge their own thinking and explore other people's perspectives. So in other words, I believe that it's in dialogue with people with whom we disagree that we learn that System 2 thinking. We learn how to really interrogate our beliefs because we're speaking to somebody who's going to start to interrogate those assumptions, those beliefs. They're going to ask us for evidence. They're going to challenge our claims. And if it's done in the right context, that kind of dialogue can teach us to engage in a really even-handed, two-sided kind of thinking. So in my research, I ask, how do we flip the goals of argumentation? How do we teach students to see opposing viewpoints as an opportunity to reflect on what they already believe instead of as an opportunity just to prove their point? And I think that one answer is to change the goals of argument. Generally, we use argument in a variety of different ways. We can use it to prove a point. We can use it to convince others to see things our way. We use it to negotiate a deal. We use it to reach a verdict. And so I'm interested in two particular goals in argumentative discourse. The first one is what you could call persuasion goals, and that's arguing to convince somebody. And it's the kind of argument I think most people typically get into in public discourse. It's either that or it's something called a heuristic argument, which is when you're arguing just because you're mad at somebody. And the other goal of argument that I'm interested in looking at, it's called deliberative goals, and that's the goal to reach consensus. So when we ask lawyers to argue, their goal is to persuade. But when we ask jurors to argue, their goal is to deliberate or to reach a verdict. And so one is arguing to convince, and the other one is arguing to reach consensus. But both are valid forms of argument, and each one has its purpose. But I think that the goal of reaching consensus, as it turns out, is a more effective way of teaching students or young people how to listen, learn, question and revise their thinking. So I think it's really arguing to reach consensus that really teaches us how in dialogue we can start to interrogate our own beliefs, because we're engaged in a kind of a self or a safe interrogation of each other's ideas in consensus-seeking dialogue. And what I found is that in academic contexts, we tend to teach students to argue through debate. That's the arguing to convince. But in my research, I found that persuasion goals are not nearly as powerful as a learning tool as consensus goals. So in one study I ran, adolescents were asked to argue about renewable energy sources with a peer, and one group had to argue to convince their peer, and the other had to argue to reach consensus. And the persuasion group learned more content and wrote more sophisticated arguments than kids in the control group that didn't argue at all. But the kids in the deliberation group, the ones who were arguing to reach consensus, learned more content and developed more sophisticated arguments as a result of their dialogues. And then if you looked at the dialogues themselves, what you see is in the persuasion dialogue, people are trying to shout each other down. They're trying to dismiss each other's arguments and blindly reject each other's claims. And in the consensus-seeking dialogue, they're doing just the opposite. They were often elaborating each other's ideas. They're asking good questions to better understand why the person with whom they disagreed held that view. And they're more likely, as a result, to moderate or adjust their own conclusions and make more sophisticated conclusions for having talked in that way with their peers. So the point isn't that we need to reach consensus when we argue, but that we need to approach an argument with the goal of arriving at a conclusion that really takes all points under consideration.
A conclusion that takes all points under consideration. I have to say, that seems challenging in America today. Ever since the election, we've heard report after report on the news and social media about conflict and how divided we are as a nation. Given that this is the case, that Americans seem more divided than ever, does your research offer any insights into how we can better understand each other's viewpoints in this context?
Honestly, no. Not as long as the issues that we discuss are framed to be polemical. The whole point of my research is actually how to look at arguments not as opportunities to prove the opposite person wrong, but rather to explore their opinions. And I think that right now in the media and in the political discourse, issues are raised not to discuss, but to divide. I think oftentimes the issues that came out in this last campaign were more about gaining voters and dividing the electorate than really engaging in discussions of the issues. They're really designed to send people to vote for one candidate or the other. And we ask, which side are you on, rather than should we address this particular problem in a particular way? And what policy do you propose? And so instead of talking about how we address problems in ways that meet the underlying concerns of those with whom we disagree, we simply fire off absolute statements that we're already personally committed to and take sides on the issue. So I think that the only way to really change the discourse that's out there is to change the way in which we're framing the arguments that we're getting in. So if we approach problems in an I win or you lose viewpoint, then we won't get constructive dialogue. I mean, that is precisely what persuasion dialogue aims to do. So if instead we followed the lead of the middle schoolers as the consensus condition of my study, we'd explore each other's positions. We'd try to get at the roots of their beliefs and then respond to those underlying concerns. We'd ask, why do we disagree, instead of how do we disagree? So the interesting thing is that I ran a similar study with college students, and in that case, they were discussing capital punishment. And in that group, they rarely reached consensus. You know, capital punishment is also a fairly polemical issue. But when they came at it with the goal of trying to reach consensus, they did start to ask each other questions that they found, the answers for which they found were valid. And so the key characteristics of those dialogues wasn't that they ultimately agreed with each other at the end of the dialogue, but again, they engaged in this form of discourse where they're really trying to understand each other's perspectives and see where there was common ground to see if they could somehow adjust their opinions in ways that everybody could be happy with.
It is a particularly tough challenge because there seems to be a perception that the other side is going to disagree with you on every issue just because they won or just because they lost. How can one change this mindset?
I'd say get out there and talk with people who disagree with you on the issues. Not to prove them wrong, but to understand why they believe what they do as deeply as you can. There's this phenomenon in psychology we call the false consensus effect, and it's an overestimation in the strength of your position that comes from only arguing issues with people with whom you agree already. So we tend to surround ourselves with people who are like-minded, and when we discuss these issues that are out there in the political sphere, we generally talk with people that agree with us, and so we build these arguments with people who we already agree with, and we get this sense that our own views are the normal view, and any opposing view is some crazy fringe view. And instead of recognizing that people who disagree with you may be crazy and fringe, but they also may have some really principled and reasonable reasons for holding the positions that they hold. So, it's a lot safer to talk politics in a room of like-minded people because we'd all like to avoid engaging in heated arguments. But it also leads to a misperception, and it allows us to too easily dismiss the views of people who disagree with us for reasons that we might find valid. So if we step outside of our comfort zone and talk across borders, we'll start to find valid points that others have for holding their views, or just the act of genuinely listening to them might draw them to do the same and really question their own views. So in either case, we have to start with finding beliefs and goals that we hold in common, and that's the first step towards true deliberation. By first acknowledging how we agree with each other, we can start to address why we disagree with each other in ways that make it safe and in ways in which either side could potentially adjust their views. So, I read a recent op-ed by this guy named Derek Black. I think it was called Why I Left White Nationalism. And he's the godson of David Duke, and his father published one of the first white nationalist websites. And he was a Politico. He, I guess, got his first office in West Palm Beach and got 60% of the vote on a white nationalist platform. And soon after, he went off to college. He went to a liberal arts college. And at college, there was a lot of protests about him first arriving. But when he got to his dorms, he met people and started having conversations with people. And people were very tolerant, and they were committed to hearing his views and disagreeing with his views. And as a result, during the course of college, he completely flipped his thinking around. And now he is, working to undermine the white nationalist movement and really raise consciousness about it. And in sociology, we call that building social capital through bridging. Sociologists talk about social capital as kind of like the connections that we have in the world around us and the kind of the power and access that those connections allow us. And they talk about these two forces in building social capital. One's called bonding, and that's spreading your network of connections within group with people who have similar views as you do. And they talk about bridging, which is building your social network with people who don't hold the same views with you, getting a sort of diverse crowd of people with which we interact. And it's that bridging behavior that ultimately leads to greater tolerance and wider social influence.
How can teachers or parents set up environments to support this bridging behavior and the kind of deliberative discourse you've described?
Okay, I'll try to keep this short and punchy. First, I'd say for teachers, create contexts where students are arguing to learn about a topic. So use argument in the classroom. The second is set up consensus goals in those argumentative dialogues. So don't set the goal of debating the issues and proving the other person wrong, but instead set the goal of discussing the issues in order to arrive at a conclusion. The third thing I'd say is help students notice the conversational moves they use to ask questions and interpret statements that their peers say and guide the conversation towards points of consensus among the students. So help them engage in those things that I described earlier as the hallmarks of deliberative dialogue, asking good questions, trying to understand each other's perspectives, and potentially adjusting your views to respond to valid points from their peers. Another thing I'd say is set ground rules for productive dialogue. So go into the dialogue recognizing that the dialogue can get a little tense at times, that disagreeing will happen, but that's okay. so long as the disagreeing is based in reasons and evidence. And then I'd say most importantly, teach students to reflect back on their argumentative discussions and help them see the power of deliberative dialogue to expand their thinking and refine their conclusions. So if they walk away from that conversation with a better understanding of the content that they were just discussing, or if they walk away from that with a better thesis statement for an essay that they're about to write, then they'll start to see, oh yeah, when I talk with somebody who disagrees with me, it allows me to understand my own perspective a little better. And then I'd say for parents, model tolerance by going out there and talking with people who hold different perspectives. Show your kids that it's okay to disagree with others and to have principles, but that it's also important to understand those other people's perspectives. And ultimately, teach them that the goal is not necessarily to agree on a topic. The goal is to find common ground and build bridges so that genuine dialogue can begin.
Thank you, Dr. Felton, for the thought-provoking conversation. Dr. Felton's publications can be found on www.sjsu.edu, including a book on teaching these skills in history classrooms available from Teachers College Press. The conversation continues on Take Note. Subscribe to hear the next podcast on this topic and others. This is Deanna Turgeon. Thank you for listening.